One of the things you do if you negotiate with yourself is I'm going to set a goal and then see if you move towards it. And if you don't, well, maybe it's the wrong goal. Maybe it's too large. Maybe it's too small for you, right? So now it's not engaging you. Maybe you didn't really want to pursue that goal and you're just deluding yourself. And, it's helpful to have someone to talk those things over with. But I would say, if you're not doing what you want to do or what you think you should be doing, drop the presumption that you know who you are and start to negotiate with yourself like you're a stranger who needs to be enticed forward. Because you don't know who you are, especially if you're not able to regulate your behavior, because that's evidence that you don't know who you are. Something is driving the ship. It's not you, or it's not the you think you are. And that's often extremely humiliating to people because you may have to pick a goal that's so low, so lowly, right, that you embarrass yourself half to death by recognizing the necessity of you having to practice that. But the upside of that is that improvement, incremental improvement, scales exponentially. So even if you have to start somewhere really trivially, man, once you start, you can really scale up quickly. And so, and with an exponential increase, which I think improvement is, the trajectory of improvement is characterized by a power law function. It doesn't really matter where you start if you're doubling. Look, think you get 1% better a week. That's not that high a goal, right? Maybe you could get rid of 1% of your stupidity and malevolence a week, or maybe every 2 weeks. Because that compounds in 3 years, you are a completely different person. And it doesn't end there. So even if you're starting with, the horrible mixed bag of catastrophes that you actually are, if you're diligent in your attempts to rectify your errors and to aim higher, man. And then with regards to your goals, let's say you don't know what to do. Well, maybe you're high in openness and so you're pulled in all sorts of directions, or maybe you're low in conscientiousness, or you're confused because you're anxious, or you haven't had any direction, you haven't had good mentoring, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of reasons. Well, I would say, pick something, right? Pick something, a nameable goal, and then try to implement it. And what'll happen is, you'll learn a lot by trying to implement it. And one of the things you might learn is what a slightly better goal might be. Because if you try something diligently and you succeed or you fail, you're going to learn from the effort expended in the detailed implementation of the goal is going to inform you. It'll also transform you physiologically. It does that at a very basic level, neurophysiological level. You will be slightly different as a consequence of the attempt. And what that'll mean is that the next goal you pick will be a little more suited to you. And so it's this kind of pathway, right? It's like maybe the goal you should be attaining is here, but you don't know that because you're clueless. And so you aim there. Well, it's better than there. And it's not nothing. It's not cessation of movement. And, if you're supposed to go there and you go here, but you walk diligently towards it, you're a little closer once you get to here than you were here. And it's this oscillating self-corrective process that leads you to the final star. And you have to be willing to engage in erroneous experimentation to manage that, but it is a self-correcting process. And so one of the things I always talk to my clients about is, well, let's try something, and we'll reserve to ourselves the right to alter our trajectory. And then I would use as a corrective there, because you might say, well, how do you know when you're not just giving up, right? Instead of thinking maybe you need a different goal. And I would say, well, if you're really concerned about your proclivity for self-deception, you can enter into a contract with yourself that you won't replace any goal you've set with a goal that's easier. And so you can switch your goal, but it has to be a little harder so that you check yourself against that tendency to withdraw and avoid and be self-deceptive. And that works like a charm. And if you do that with some degree of diligence, your goals will get better and more attainable, and you'll get happier too, because you don't experience happiness except in relationship to a goal. And that's really worth knowing. And that's another thing to think about too. If your life is meaningless, well, you're not pursuing a valued goal. You might be depressed too, and sometimes that can be like an illness, something that is really wrong with you. But a good rule of thumb is that if you find no joy in life, there's a very low probability that you're pursuing a goal that you regard intrinsically, like in the depths of your temperament, as worthwhile. And that's technically true because we do in fact experience most of the positive emotion, let's say, that's associated with emotions like joy. We experience that in relationship to a goal. So, well, then you want to find a goal that regulates your negative emotion and that brings you a certain amount of positive emotion and that expands your competence as you pursue it. And you will experience that as meaningful. That's really what meaning signals. Meaning signals you're doing all those things. You say, well, that's not real. It's like, don't listen to the semantic chatterbox so much, right? There's levels of you that are far wiser than that. And you can watch what happens to you instead of noticing what you think. You know, and that's another thing I always did with my clients, especially if they're depressed. It's like, well, let's watch you for a week and see, let's see when you're not so depressed. What are you doing when you're not so depressed? Now, for some people who had an endogenous depression, they were just depressed all the time. And sometimes an antidepressant was a good solution to that. But for people who were situationally depressed, which is equally common, let's say, there'd be quite a bit of variation in their mood and say, well, it turns out that I'm not so depressed when I'm with so-and-so. It's like, okay, well, why? And more importantly, how can we do more of that? And when were you more depressed? Well, when I'm alone in my room, brooding. Okay, well, how about you spend 10% less time this week alone in your room? Like, we'll introduce 10%, let's say. So you're awake for 16 hours, so that's an hour. Now we'd probably go for 5%, half an hour. That's a hell of an improvement over 20 weeks, right? Because that would be 100% less time doing counterproductive brooding. It's like, well, maybe you could go for a 5-minute walk every day this week, or maybe a 2-minute walk, Or maybe you go in the living room instead of your bedroom if you can't manage the walk. And so that's part of that collaborative empiricism too, right? Let's find out when your life isn't announcing itself to you as meaningless. And virtually no one feels the absence of meaning all the time. Even nihilistic punk rockers like going to the local bar and smashing into each other in the mosh pit. So I know that's a dated reference, but you get what I mean. One of the things I've really learned more explicitly, I would say in the last 6 months, is to not win. I knew this already. Like in my clinical practice, I tried my best not to be right. So for example, as a clinician, you can dispense advice. And so it'd be quite easy, especially if I wasn't suffering at that time while practicing as a clinician. And the person was, I think, well, I've got my life together pretty well, and I'll just tell you what you should do. And sometimes people would ask for that, right? But it's not that helpful because, well, what the hell do you know about what they should do? You can introduce topics of conversation like, well, most people have friends and you don't seem to have any. And, maybe you have a reason for that. And maybe it's a, fundamentally valid reason. And that's not where your interests are oriented. Maybe you're particularly introverted, which doesn't mean you don't need friends. But that's way different than saying, well, here's what you should do. And the problem with here's what you should do is, first of all, as the psychoanalyst knew, you just set up resistances in people. And the reason, so they won't do it, even if they want your advice. And often they'll do the opposite, just out of spite, and probably they should, because they're basically saying, up yours. It's like, this is my life, man, not yours. And the other problem with advice is, well, let's say you take my advice and then you go do something good. It's like, well, whose victory is that? Is it yours or mine? So did I just steal your victory? Well, that's not so good. And so I learned that pretty thoroughly as a clinician, not to do that, and hopefully as a husband and father, also not to do that. But I was more instrumental than I should have been. There were points I was trying to make, and I was trying to be right. And, there's times for that, and there's partisan situations where only one side can win and another side has to lose. An election is like that. But I've really learned, I hope, that in the last 6 or 7 months to not do that. Not to do that. And so winning is not a good strategy, or maybe it's better than losing. Let's say it's not an optimal strategy, right? That's a better way of thinking about it. And if you're trying to win a conversation, that might be better than losing, but it's not as good as mutual elevation in the progression of the discourse. That's way better. That's a real victory. And so I hope that I've learned that more deeply, and that I can take that to heart more deeply, and then I can govern my actions